I never seen such a high-strung guy, Tommy told me. A man like that should never want to be a burglar, especially not with a gun. The slightest little noise, he'd go 3 feet into the air and come down shooting, more likely than not. One night he almost strangled me because some guy down the hall was whopping his cell bars with a tin cup. I did 7 months with him until they let me walk free. I got time served and time off, you understand? I can't say we talked because you didn't, exactly hold a conversation with El Blotch. He held a conversation with you. He talked all the time, never shut up. If you tried to get a word in, he'd shake his fist at you and roll his eyes. Gave me the cold chills whenever he done that. Big, tall he was, mostly bald, with those green eyes set way down deep in the sockets. Jeez, I hope I never see him again. It was like talking Jag every night, where he grew up, the orphanages he run away from, the jobs he done, the woman he fucked, the crap games he cleaned out. I just let him run on. My face ain't much, but I didn't want it, rearranged for me. According to him, he'd burglared over 200 joints. It was hard for me to believe a guy like him who went off like a firecracker every time someone cut a loud fart, but he swore it was true. Now, listen to me, Red. I know guys sometimes make things up after they know a thing, but even before I knew about this Gulf Pro Quentin, I remember thinking that if El Blotch ever burgled a house and I found out about it later, I'd have to count myself just about the luckiest motherfucker going still to be alive. Can you imagine him in some lady's bedroom, shifting through her jewelry box and she coughs in her sleep or turns over quick? It gives me the cold chills just to think of something like that. I swear on my mother's name it does. He said he'd kill people, too. People that gave him shit. At least that's what he said, and I believe him. He sure looked like a man that could do some killing. He was just so fucking high-strung, like a pistol with a sawed-off firing pin. I knew a guy who had a Smith & Wesson police special with a sawed-off firing pin. It wasn't no good for nothing, except maybe for something to jaw about. The pull on that gun was so light that it would fire if this guy, Johnny Callahan, his name was, if he turned his record player on full volume and put it on top of one of the speakers, that's how El Blotch was. I can't explain it any better. I just never doubted that he had greased some people. So one night, just for something to say, I go, "Who'd you kill?" Like a joke, So he laughs and says, "There's this one guy doing time up in Maine for these 2 people I killed. It was this guy and his wife, this slob who's been doing time. I was creeping their place, and the guy started giving me some shit. I can't remember if he ever told me the woman's name or not. Maybe he did, but in New England, Dufresne's like Smith or Jones in the rest of the country because there's so many frogs up here. Dufresne, Levis, Owell, Poland, who can remember frog names? But he told me the guy's name. He said the guy was Glenn Quentin. He was a prick, a big rich prick, golf pro. El said he thought the guy might have cash in the house, maybe as much as $5,000. That was a lot of money back then, he says to me. So I go, "When was that?" And he goes, "After the war, just after the war." So we went in, and he did the joint, and they woke up, and the guy gave him some trouble. That's when El said. Maybe the guy just started to snore. That's what I say. Anyway, El said Quentin was in the sack with some hot-shot lawyer's wife, and they sent the lawyer up to Shawshank State Prison. Then he laughs this big laugh. Holy Christ. I was never so glad of anything as I was when I got my walking paper from that place. I guess you can see why Andy went a little wonky when Tommy told him that story, and why he wanted to see the warden right away. Elwood Blatch had been serving a 6 to 12 rap when Tommy knew him 4 years before. By the time Andy heard all of this in 1963, he might be on the verge of getting out, or already out. So those were the 2 prongs of the spit Andy was roasting on. The idea that Blotch might still be in on one hand, and the very real possibility that he might be gone, like the wind on the other. There were inconsistencies in Tommy's story, but aren't there always in real life? Blotch told Tommy the man who got set up was a hotshot lawyer, and Andy was a banker, but those are 2 professions that people who aren't very educated could easily get mixed up. And don't forget that 12 years had gone by between the time that Blotch was reading the clippings about the trial and the time he had told the tale to Tommy Williams. He also told Tommy he got better than $1,000 from a footlocker Quentin had in his closet, but the police said at Andy's trial that there had been no signs of burglary. I have a few ideas about that. First, if you take the cash and the man it belonged to is dead, how are you going to know anything was stolen unless someone else can tell you it was there to start with? Second, who's to say Blotch wasn't lying about that part of it? Maybe he didn't want to admit to killing 2 people for nothing. Third, maybe there were signs of burglary, and the cops either overlooked them, cops can be pretty dumb, or deliberately covered them up so they wouldn't screw the DA's case. The guy was running for public office, remember, and he needed a conviction to run on. An unsolved burglary murder would have done him no good at all. But of the three, I like the middle one best. I've known a few Elwood blotches in my time at Shawshank, the trigger pullers with the crazy eyes. Such fellows want you to think they got away with the equivalent of the Hope Diamond on every caper, even if they got caught with a $2 Timex and $9 on one they're doing time for. And there was one thing in Tommy's story that convinced Andy beyond a shadow of a doubt. Blotch hadn't hit Quentin at random. He had called Quentin a big rich prick, and he had known Quentin was a golf pro. Well, Andy and his wife had been going out to that country club for drinks and dinner once or twice a week for a couple years, and Andy had done a considerable amount of drinking there once he found out about his wife's affair. There was a marina, the country club, and for a while in 1947 there had been a part-time grease and gas jockey working there who matched Tommy's description of Elwood Blotch. A big tall man, mostly bald, with deep-set green eyes. A man who had an unpleasant way of looking at you, as though he was sizing you up. He wasn't there long, Andy said. Either he quit, or Briggs, the fellow in charge of the marina, fired him. But he wasn't a man you forgot. He was too striking for that. So Andy went to see Warden Norton on a rainy, windy day with big gray clouds scudding across the sky above the gray walls, a day when the last of the snow was starting to melt away and show lifeless patches of last year's grass in the fields beyond the prison. The warden has a good-sized office in the administration wing, and behind the warden's desk there's a door which connects with the assistant warden's office. The assistant warden was out that day, but a trustee was there. He was a half-lame fellow whose real name I've forgotten. All the inmates, me included, called him Chester, after Martian Dillon's sidekick. Chester was supposed to be watering the plants and waxing the floor. My guess is that the plants went thirsty that day, and the only waxing that was done happened because of Chester's dirty ear polishing the keyhole plate of that connecting door. He heard the warden's main door open and close, and then Norton saying, "Good morning, Dufresne, how can I help you?" "Warden," Andy began, and old Chester told us that he could hardly recognize Andy's voice. It was so changed. "Warden, there's something's happened to me. That's so... I hardly know where to begin." "Well, why don't you just begin at the beginning?" the warden said, probably in his sweetest let's all turn to the 23rd Psalm and read in unison voice. That usually works the best. And so Andy did. He began by refreshing Norton on the details of the crime he had been imprisoned for. Then he told the warden exactly what Tommy Williams had told him. He also gave out Tommy's name, which you may think wasn't so wise in light of later developments, but I'd just ask you what else he could have done if the story was to have any credibility at all. When he had finished, Norton was completely silent for some time. I can just see him, probably tipped back in his office chair under the picture of Governor Reed hanging on his wall, his fingers steepled, his liver lips pursed, his brow wrinkled into ladder rungs halfway to the crown of his head, his 30-year pin gleaming mellowly. "Yes," he said finally, "that's the damnedest story I ever heard, but I'll tell you what surprises me most about it, Dufresne." "What's that, sir?" "That you were taken in by it." "Sir, I don't understand what you mean." And Chester said that Andy Dufresne, who had faced down Byron Hadley on the plate shop roof 13 years before, was almost floundering for words. "Well now," Norton said, "it's pretty obvious to me that this young fellow Williams is impressed with you. Quite taken with you, as a matter of fact. He hears your tale of woe, and it's quite natural of him to want to cheer you up, let's say. Quite natural. He's a young man, not terribly bright. Not surprising he didn't realize what a state it would put you into. Now, what I suggest is, don't you think I thought of that?" Andy asked. "But I'd never told Tommy about the man working down at the marina. I never told anyone that it ever crossed my mind. But Tommy's description of his cellmate and that man, they're identical." "Well, now, you may be indulging in a little selective perception there," Norton said with a chuckle. "Phrases like that, selective perception, are required learning for people in the penology and corrections business, and they use them all they can. That's not it at all, sir. That's your slant on it, Norton said. But mine differs, and let's remember that I have only your words. There was such a man working at the Falmouth Hills Country Club back then. No, sir, Andy broke in again. No, that isn't true because... Anyway, Norton overrode him, expansive and loud. Let's just take a look at it from the other end of the telescope, shall we? Just suppose now, that there was really a fellow named Elwood Blatch. Blatch, Andy said tightly. Blatch, by all means. And let's say he was Thomas Williams' cellmate in Rhode Island. The chances are excellent that he has been released by now. Excellent. Why? We didn't even know how much time he might have done there before he ended up with Williams, do we? Only that he was doing 6 to 12. No, we don't know how much time he'd done, but Tommy said he was a bad actor, a cut-up. I think there's a fair chance that he may still be in, even if he's been released. The prison will have a record of his last known address, the names of his relatives, and both would almost certainly be dead ends. Andy was silent for a moment, then he burst out. Well, it's a chance, isn't it? Yes, of course it is. So, just for a moment, Dufresne, let's assume that Blatch exists, and that he is still safely ensconced in the Rhode Island State Penitentiary. Now, what is he going to say if we bring this kettle of fish to him in a bucket? Is he going to fall down on his knees, roll his eyes, and say, I did it, by all means, add a life term onto my charge? How can you be so obtuse, Andy said, so low that Chester could barely hear, but he heard the warden just fine. What did you call me? Obtuse, Andy cried. Is it deliberate? Dufresne, you've taken 5 minutes of my time. No, 7. And I have a very busy schedule today. So I believe we'll just declare this little meeting closed, and the country club will have all the old-time cards. Don't you realize that? Andy shouted. They'll have tax forms and W-2s and unemployment compensation forms, all with his name on them. There will be employees there now that were there. Maybe Briggs himself. It's been 15 years, not forever. They'll remember him. They'll remember Blatch. If I've got Tommy to testify what Blatch told him and Briggs to testify that Blatch was there, actually working at the country club, I can get a new trial. I can guard. Take this man away. What's the matter with you? Andy said, and Chester told me he was very nearly screaming by then. It's my life, my chance to get out. Don't you see that? And you won't make a single long-distance call to at least verify Tommy's story? Listen, I'll pay for the call. Then there was the sound of thrashing as the guards grabbed him and started to drag him out. Solitary, Warden Norton said dryly. He was probably fingering his 30-year pin as he said it. Bread and water. And so they dragged Andy away, totally out of control now, still screaming at the warden. Chester said you could hear him even after the door was shut. It's my life, don't you understand? It's my life. 20 days on the grain and drain train for Andy down there in solitary. It was his second jolt in solitary, and his dust-up with Norton was his first real black mark since he had joined our happy little family. I'll tell you a little bit about Shawshank solitary while we're on the subject. It's something of a throwback to those hardy pioneer days of the early to mid-1700s in Maine. In those days, no one wasted much time with such things as penology and rehabilitation and selective perception. In those days, you were taken care of in terms of absolute black and white. You were either guilty or innocent. If you were guilty, you were either hung or put in jail. And if you were sentenced to jail, you did not go to an institution, no. You dug your own jail with the spade provided by the province of Maine. You dug it as wide and as deep as you could during the period between sunup and sundown. Then, they gave you a couple of skins and a bucket, and down you went. Once down, the gazer would bar the top of your hole, throw down some grain or maybe a piece of maggoty meat once or twice a week, and maybe there would be a dipper full of barley soup on Sunday night. You pissed in the bucket, and you held up the same bucket for water when the gazer came around at 6 in the morning. When it rained, you used the bucket to bail out your jail cell, unless that is, you wanted to drown like a rat in a rain barrel. No one spent a long time in the hole, as it was called. 30 months was an unusually long term. And so far as I have been able to tell, the longest term ever spent from which an inmate actually emerged alive was served by the so-called Durham boy, a 14-year-old psychopath who castrated a schoolmate with a piece of rusty metal.